Marvel Snap's summer beach season is in full swing, so let's go under the waves with the Submariner, who frankly seems a little subpar. Submariner is a 1/2, which is already a pretty awkward spot for a card like this to land in, because a lot of the time 1-drops have a hard time being the thing you build the deck around. And there are a couple of reasons for this, one of them structural and one of them contextual. The structural reason why it's difficult for 1-drops to be the thing that you build the deck around is that they're very rarely slipping up on balance on 1-drops because there are just fewer numbers that they can put on a 1-drop. For example, I would say that the only seriously busted 1-drop that really registers on the balance scale is typically going to be Batroc, and then whatever the biggest 1-drop is at any given time. So outside of just being Martyr at 1/6 or Hydra Bob at 1/5, we've really only seen one 1-drop scalar actually be relevant in Marvel Snap, and everything else is playing more of a supporting role. And that's not necessarily a problem. That's a fine thing for cards to do. But the problem is when they design a 1-cost card outside of that supporting role, they design it as a build around. I think it's just sort of inherently kind of limiting, because when you make these build around exciting, I want to go out and play with this card, and then you make that card a 1-cost, you're kind of capping how exciting it can possibly be. And I think Submariner is kind of a victim of that. The second, which is not a structural problem, but more of a contextual one, is that even if a card like this ever gets good, it ends up being extremely weak to things like Killmonger. And specifically, Killmonger is extra good against Submariner than it is against basically anything else, even in this space. You look at something like Clea, well, at least Killmonger, when it kills your Clea, isn't killing all the stuff Clea makes for you, too. This is a really awkward choice for a space to design a card in, and I think that for these reasons, Submariner tends to suffer. It's unfortunate, but true. There's one other thing that I think is holding Submariner back, and it's sort of the packages he tends to go with. Marvel Boy is a card that is deeply underpowered that they seem to be extremely cautious on for reasons I'm not particularly sure of. This is a card that goes very well with Marvel Boy. There's a lot of cool things going on there, but fundamentally is limited by the fact that it is a Marvel Boy card, right? Like, there's not a lot to be done with this space. That space is sort of full, and there's a cap on how big it can get. And while it has been fun messing around with all these weird little packages that you can do some reasonable stuff with a 1-drop in, he hasn't really been the star of any of it. There are also a couple of interactions that I wish worked differently. The first is Venus doesn't work with him at all. And you'd think what might happen is you get one and then you get another with an additional one. None of that happens. You don't even get anything when Venus affects him, which is extremely weird. And the second thing is that this card would be a lot better if it gave its cumulative buff to the next card that it made and not the individual instance of the buff. For example, if you play this on an Agony, it will give +2 to the card that it makes, but if you then Marvel Boy it, it will then make a card with +1 instead of +3. And I think changing that just could go a really long way towards making this card something that is actually just a lot more interesting and a lot more compelling as a game piece. We're going to start with a list from Ika, which I think is a pretty solid way to approach playing Submariner, which is to say it's not that bad, but it's not that good. And I think a lot of Submariner stuff is going to be in this space where it's like, all right, what can I do with this? Being second Clea is a good thing to do. There's really like no way around that. It's like a fine little mid-rangey thing. Second Clea is awesome. The problem is 100 out of 100 times, if I have the choice between this and Clea, I'm taking Clea. If I have the choice between getting a buff on this or Clea, I'm taking Clea. It is second fiddle to Clea in basically every single deck that it's going to be in, and Clea is not a card that is running the metagame right now. Clea is a very fine and playable card as long as the metagame stays fair. A lot of things are viable as long as metagames stay fair. She has very little ability to go very tall. This is a card that thrives in mid-range metas, and everything that is true about Clea is true about Submariner, except he has one less point of power. His things don't actually end up leaving the board, so they're taking up board space, and it's usually going to end up just being about the same amount of power as a Clea anyway. There's just A lot of downsides on this compared to Clea that make me wonder what the point of it was. I think that this is an interesting card, but it lacks a hook, and if it had that additional ability to pass its entire buff on, then we'd be talking about it more as like actual alt Clea rather than as bad Clea. But that really does seem to be where this list ends up on it. And there's some stuff to be done here when you play a deck like this, but you run into hand clog issues, you run into power output issues. The Professor-esque stuff is real, and you'll see other builds of this where you're like doing Werewolf by Night stuff as well. Werewolf by Night spells, Professor X, that's a reasonable thing to do. It's just not inspiring. It's a very fine deck that does very fine things. And the same kind of goes here. Like, there's some overlap here, just repeatable one costs off of a Lockheed, a power output program in the form of Venus and all of these buffs. I think this is actually a pretty well put together deck, and I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being the best of these decks, even though it is running, yes, Mad Thinker, because we really do hand clog that much. But this is the kind of deck that's at least doing, here are some points, here is some interaction, and that's enough. I don't know that this is the right interaction. I don't know that these are the right points, but what Venus has done in this metagame is make stuff like this a lot more viable. And I think one of the worst things about Submariner is how he just doesn't work the way you want, or really any way at all with Venus, which makes playing all of these other cards with Venus your actual game plan, and Submariner is just sort of along for the ride. And even in this list, he's your second Clea, which is not a bad thing to do. There's some Lockheed upside. There's a lot of points in here. It's not embarrassing, but it is sort of hard stuck tier 2. This is a 2023 kind of deck, and Venus is dragging it up to 2026-ish levels of performance, but not able to put it in tier 1 all by herself. This is a really fun deck, though. Another place you can attempt to find some overlap and synergy is with created cards in Victoria Hand, and of course also Shang-Chi Master of the Rings, but I think that this deck gets some things that are mostly just incorrect compared to a typical Victoria Hand deck. And I don't mean incorrect like it's bad deck building or anything like that. I mean that by trying to accommodate Submariner, the deck has been made worse at winning games. And that's not the fault of the deck builder or anything like that. It's just, that's what happens when you try to use a good card as a backbone for a bad card. You kind of end up with the good card doing a lot of the work, and you definitely feel that in a deck like this, where it's like, I do like, specifically with Shang-Chi Master of the Rings, having a second Clea. This is one of those cases where, specifically with Shang-Chi Master of the Rings, this guy is an upgrade because he just gives you more draws that are actually live. You are always playing that card on turn 2. That's a really good thing to do. It's a very straightforward and solid and powerful part of what this deck is able to do. And it does help to have a one drop that you actually want to hit with that. That's awesome. It's great. It's not enough to make this whole thing good, and it's not enough to make Shang-Chi good, and it's not enough to make Submariner good, and it's sort of like throwing good money after bad, where it's like, okay, so Submariner, not necessarily worth building around. Submariner Shang-Chi, not necessarily worth building around. What if we threw Victoria Hand in here so she could do all the actual work? Last up, a cavalcade of like Venus Wiccan pile basically is what's going on here. I don't think this is necessarily all that bad. Like, I've got a healthy respect for Venus decks, which is to say, I think they're all fairly medium, but they're on the upper end of medium. They're not the best decks in the game, but they can absolutely win games because they just do a decent amount of points. And I love playing Marvel Snap when there are points piles to be played. And I love how all these decks interact with each other. And frankly, if everyone could convince everyone else to just keep playing Venus decks, I think this metagame would be super fun for an extended period of time. I don't know how much longer we have in it, but it would be great. I love these decks. I love playing them. This is a deck that I played against, and it was shockingly good at outputting points. There was some serious work here. This one and the previous one, the one 2 decks ago we talked about with the Venus Angela Bishop stuff, I think that one's probably a little bit better of an execution on the principle, but this one gets to play some bigger, cooler cards, gets to use Shang-Chi in a sort of more proactive way. And you have, of course, when you're playing a Shang-Chi deck, I do think that this is one of those few cases where it's like, this is actually definitely going in this deck. It's a very specific place for it to go, but Submariner is definitely going in the Shang-Chi no Quicksilver Wiccan deck. Definitely goes in there because you really want to start the game out with either Submariner or Clea. Having two of them really multiplies your ability to do that. And that is a very good and very useful thing. Is it going to be able to make this deck a meta deck? No, but that's not really Submariner's fault. That's because it's a Shang-Chi Wiccan deck. So overall, Submariner, I mean, there's a couple things I could say here. One is he feels a point of power light, like he could be a 1/3, but I also think that if he was a 1/3, he still wouldn't be that good. What really gets me about this are the two interactions that he doesn't have. He doesn't work with Venus, and he doesn't pass on his total buff. And so if you're asking me, KM, what would you do to make this a more exciting game piece that people would actually be interested in playing a lot with? I think that those are the pitches. I think the Venus one you could argue is a bug. I don't actually know what the intended outcome there is, but that one you could argue is a bug. The not passing on the total buff, that seems pretty clearly intended, but I think it might have been an incorrect decision. I think it could have been a much cooler, more interesting card if it was passing on the total buff. I think it's a reasonable way to try to approach playing a card like this to give it some real differentiation from Clea. And I think, when they make a card, they should have a bar that's probably at or above Clea. And I don't think this card meets that bar. So that's sort of where I'm at on Submariner. By the way, I am hearing a lot of people call him Submariner. No, it is the Submariner. Namor the Submariner. For those who are unaware, that is a Namor right there. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.